murder of Kim Groves. On October 13, 1994, a 32-year-old single mother of three was shot once in the head as she stood on Alamo Street in the lower 9th Ward of New Orleans. The man who pulled the trigger was a hired hitman. But the man who ordered it was the same police officer she had filed a complaint against just hours earlier. And the FBI heard every word of it. So, how does a woman report a cop for misconduct and end up dead before sunrise? Kim Marie Groves had witnessed NOPD Officer Len Davis and his partner, Officer Sammy Williams, pistol whip a 17-year-old named Nathan Norwood. At approximately 3:30 in the afternoon on October 12th, she filed an 8-page civil rights complaint with NOPD Internal Affairs, naming Davis specifically. Davis, nicknamed RoboCop and the Desire Project's terrorist, was tipped off about the confidential complaint within hours by another officer. A woman filed a complaint in the afternoon. By that night, the officer she named already knew about it. What Davis did not know was that the FBI had been watching him for months under Operation Shattered Shield, an investigation triggered by a dealer's complaint that NOPD officers were extorting him. The FBI had been building a corruption case against Davis and several other officers in the 5th District. They had given Davis a wiretapped cell phone, and he used it freely, never suspecting he was being recorded. The recordings captured everything. Davis paging hitman Paul "Cool" Hardy, describing Groves' appearance, including bleach stains on her faded jeans, her exact location on Alamo Street. And then, after Hardy shot her once in the head around 11 at night, Davis jumping up and down in joy, exclaiming, "Yeah, yeah, yeah! Rock, rock-a-bye." A line from the film New Jack City used before shooting someone. The FBI had the entire conspiracy on tape, recorded in real time. They heard the order go out. They heard the confirmation that it was done. And they heard the celebration afterward. The hit happened the same night new Police Superintendent Richard Pennington was being sworn in across town, a ceremony meant to signal a new era for the department. Davis, Hardy, and associate Damon Causey were arrested on December 5, 1994. FBI search warrants executed on November 2nd had already recovered the 9mm Beretta used to take Kim's life from Causey's apartment. The weapon was traced directly to Hardy. Davis was tried in federal court beginning April 8, 1996, before Judge Ginger Berrigan. The wiretap recordings were played for the jury. They heard Davis describe Kim Groves in detail, heard him give the order, and heard him celebrate when it was done. There was no ambiguity. Convicted on all counts, including conspiracy to deprive civil rights under color of law and witness tampering, he was sentenced to death on April 26th, making him the first on-duties police officer sentenced to death for federal civil rights offenses. Hardy was also sentenced to death, but had his sentence commuted to life in 2011 after being found intellectually disabled. Causey received life after rejecting a 6 to 9 year plea deal, a decision that cost him any chance of ever walking free. On December 23, 2024, President Biden commuted Davis's death sentence to life without parole as part of a mass commutation of 37 federal death row inmates. Davis actually tried to block the commutation, arguing that death row gave him better appellate leverage. A federal judge rejected his motion. He was transferred to ADX Florence, the federal supermax in Colorado, where he remains as of March 2026, still maintaining his innocence. The broader corruption was staggering. By 1994, more than 40 NOPD officers had been arrested in 3 years for serious offenses, including bank robbery and worse. The department was not just failing to protect people, it was actively harming them. The city recorded 421 homicides that year, making it one of the most dangerous cities in the country. Years later, it emerged that Davis had framed innocent people for crimes they did not commit. Burnell Juluka Jr., Leroy Nelson, Kunta Gable, and Sherman Singleton collectively spent over 100 years wrongfully imprisoned before being released in 2022. Davis had not just taken Kim Grove's life. He had destroyed the lives of people he was supposed to be serving. The city settled with Groves' 3 children for $1.5 million in 2018. Her daughter Jasmine became a police reform advocate and founded the nonprofit Supreme Mothers of Joy, a mother taken for filing a complaint. But the next case would reveal what Hurricane Katrina did to people who stayed behind, and how love and trauma can collapse into something unrecognizable. Zach Bowen and Addie Hall. In September 2005, the New York Times profiled a couple of bartenders who had refused to evacuate during Hurricane Katrina, mixing cocktails for passersby while the city flooded around them. Time magazine ran their photos. They were held up as symbols of New Orleans spirit. 13 months later, one of them strangled the other, dismembered the body, and cooked the remains on the stove before jumping from a hotel rooftop. So what happened between the magazine covers and the crime scene? Zachary Morgan Bowen was born on May 15, 1978, in Los Angeles. He served in the United States Army as a military policeman in Kosovo and Iraq, including Abu Ghraib, rising to sergeant before receiving a general discharge that denied him GI Bill benefits. The discharge meant no educational assistance, no housing support, and no structured path back into civilian life. Friends said he was devastated by the passing of an Iraqi boy he had befriended, taken in a mortar attack. That loss stayed with him. He returned to New Orleans deeply changed, carrying trauma that he never sought treatment for. His ex-wife Lana Shupak said he was a completely different person from the man she had married. He began bartending in the French Quarter, where the culture of late nights and heavy drinking made it easy to avoid dealing with what was underneath. Adrienne Addie Hall, 30 at the time of her passing, was a North Carolina native from a difficult household who had made the French Quarter her home, bartending at the Spotted Cat on Frenchman Street. She was a poet, dancer, and artist who called herself a Quarterican, someone who belonged to the Quarter and nowhere else. Friends reported she likely had untreated bipolar disorder and had stopped taking medication. She could be magnetic and warm one moment, volatile the next. Together, Zach and Addie became fixtures of the post-Katrina French Quarter, the couple who stayed when everyone else left. The media loved the story. It made for great copy. But behind the headlines, both were unraveling. The relationship deteriorated amid heavy drinking and substance use. On October 4th, 2006, Addie discovered Zach was seeing someone else and told their landlord she was kicking him out. It was the last time anyone saw her alive. At 1 a.m. on October 5th, Bowen strangled her. In his 8-page confession, written in Hall's journal, he wrote, "I very calmly strangled her. It was very quick." He then went to work the next morning as if nothing had happened. Over the following days, he dismembered her body in the bathtub with a hacksaw and knife, then placed the remains on the stove and in the oven. He set the air conditioning to 60 degrees to slow decomposition. For 12 days, Bowen lived as if nothing had happened. He went to work. He drank at bars. He withdrew $1,500 in cash and enjoyed what he described in his confession as good food, good friends, and good times. He tipped generously. He laughed with people who had no idea what was waiting in his apartment. 12 days of normalcy with remains in the kitchen. That is the detail that stays with people. On October 17th, 2006, he walked to the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel's rooftop bar, ordered a final drink, sat quietly for a few minutes, looking out over the French Quarter, and jumped from the roof shortly after 8:30 in the evening. In his pocket, police found a Ziploc bag containing a note, his Army dog tags, and a key to the apartment at 826 North Rampart Street, above Priestess Miriam's Voodoo Spiritual Temple. The note directed officers to the apartment. What they found there would become one of the most disturbing crime scenes in the history of New Orleans. Officers found Hall's remains throughout the kitchen. Spray-painted messages on the walls read, "I love her," I'm a total failure, and look in the oven. Bowen's body bore 28 self-inflicted cigarette burns, one for each year of his life. The case was chronicled in Ethan Brown's 2009 book, Shake the Devil Off. 2 people celebrated by the national press as survivors of Katrina. 13 months later, one was gone and the other had taken his own life. The storm may have passed, but it never really left. The storm destroyed more than buildings. But the next case happened during what should have been a celebration, Super Bowl week, and it exposed a scheme that had been operating for over a decade. Adin Manzano. On the morning of February 5th, 2025, a 27-year-old sports reporter was found face down on a pillow in his hotel room in Kenner, Louisiana. He had traveled to the New Orleans area to cover Super Bowl 59. His credit cards and cell phone were missing. His story was already tragic before he ever arrived. So what happened in that hotel room? And how did a night in the French Quarter end with a reporter who would never file another story? Adin Manzano was a sports anchor for KGKC Telemundo Kansas City and Tico Sports. He was 27 years old and had already built a reputation as one of the most passionate young sports reporters in the Kansas City market. His 24-year-old wife, Ashley Boyd, a second-grade teacher, had been taken in a car crash on April 11, 2024, leaving behind their toddler daughter. Manzano had been raising his daughter alone, working full-time and trying to keep his career moving forward through the worst year of his life. He had come to New Orleans to work, to cover the biggest sporting event in the country, carrying grief that most people could not imagine. On the night of February 4th into the 5th, Manzano was in the French Quarter when he encountered Danette Colbert, 48, of Slidell, Louisiana, a woman prosecutors would later dub the Bourbon Street Hustler. Hotel surveillance at the Comfort Suites in Kenner showed them entering his room at 4:35 in the morning. Colbert was seen leaving and returning multiple times over the next several hours, then departing for good. Manzano never left the room. He never made it to his assignment that day. That afternoon, he was found face down, deceased. Jefferson Parish Coroner, Dr. Jerry Kvitanovich, determined the cause was positional asphyxia, meaning Manzano suffocated face down after ingesting a combination of alcohol and alprazolam, a substance he had no prescription for. Investigators believe Colbert administered the substance to incapacitate him for robbery. Colbert was arrested on February 6th after investigators tracked Manzano's credit card to a gas station where it had been used just hours after his passing. A search of her home turned up his phone, credit card, the substance, and a stolen firearm. The speed of the arrest suggested Colbert had made little effort to cover her tracks, which in turn suggested she had done this before and gotten away with it. Her charges were upgraded to second degree on March 18th. Accomplice Ricky White, 34, was arrested March 14th in Fort Lauderdale by U.S. Marshals and also charged with second degree. A third suspect, Christian Anderson, 33, was arrested May 30th for providing logistical support, including renting the vehicle Colbert used that night. Text messages between the suspects referenced knockouts and KOs, coded language for the substances used to incapacitate targets. Anderson had texted in August 2024. Yes, she does before she kills someone on accident. Someone had warned, in writing, months before Manzano ever arrived in New Orleans, that this woman could take a life. The text was sitting in a phone, and no one stopped her. A July 2025 grand jury indictment revealed the scheme had been operating since 2012, over 13 years of targeting victims in New Orleans and surrounding areas. The trio had allegedly stolen at least 15 cell phones, 29 credit cards, and over $131,000 from incapacitated targets. Manzano was not the first person they had done this to. He was just the first one who did not survive. The original charges were downgraded to manslaughter, and all three were charged with racketeering. Colbert was separately sentenced to 25 years without parole for a prior fraud conviction. In January 2026, all three rejected a plea deal offering 60 years each. They remain in custody at the Jefferson Parish Correctional Center, awaiting trial as of March 2026, a scheme running for over a decade before it finally took a life. But the next case struck New Orleans on a scale no one had ever seen, on the very first hours of a new year. Bourbon Street Attack. At 3:15 in the morning on January 1st, 2025, a rented white Ford F-150 Lightning pickup truck drove onto the sidewalk at the Canal Street entrance to Bourbon Street, bypassed a police SUV barricade, and plowed into New Year's Eve revelers along a 3-block stretch. 14 people were taken, and at least 57 were injured. The driver exited wearing body armor and opened fire before police ended the threat. An ISIS flag was fixed to the trailer hitch. So who was this man? And how did he go from a decorated Army veteran to a lone attacker on the most famous street in New Orleans? Shamsuddin Bahar Jabbar, 42, was born on October 26, 1982, in Beaumont, Texas. He served in the United States Army as both a human resources specialist and IT specialist, deploying to Afghanistan in 2009 to 2010. He was not some fringe figure living off the grid. He held a bachelor's degree from Georgia State University and worked at Deloitte, earning approximately $120,000 per year. He had a career, a salary, and a professional reputation. 3 divorces, mounting debts of over $27,000 behind on his mortgage, and failed businesses preceded his radicalization. The FBI timeline indicates he became more devout by 2022, traveled to Cairo and Ontario in mid-2023, and grew increasingly extreme after the start of the Gaza conflict. He scouted Bourbon Street on October 30th through 31st and November 10th, 2024, using Meta smart glasses to record the route. He had walked the exact path his truck would later take, weeks before it happened. Jabbar had posted 5 Facebook videos between 1:29 and 3:02 in the morning, declaring allegiance to ISIS. In the videos, he spoke directly to the camera, calm and deliberate, as if recording a final message he had rehearsed. He had placed 2 pipe bombs in coolers on Bourbon Street in the 90 minutes before driving the truck, positioning them along the route to maximize harm among people fleeing the vehicle. Both contained RDX explosive and shrapnel, but failed to detonate due to crude construction. Had those devices functioned, the toll would have been catastrophically higher. The FBI declared the attack 100% inspired by ISIS, but found no evidence of direct contact with the group. He had radicalized alone, planned alone, and acted alone. The 14 victims ranged in age from 18 to 63. They were not tourists partying recklessly. They were people celebrating the start of a new year, doing what millions of Americans do every December 31st. Among them, Princeton football alum Martin Tiger Beck, 27, brother of NFL receiver Jack Beck; Edward Pettifer, 31, stepson of the former royal nanny to Princes William and Harry; Nicole Perez, 27, a recently promoted deli manager and mother who had just gotten the good news about her promotion days earlier; and Terrence Kennedy, 63, a lifelong New Orleanian who had simply gone out for a New Year's Eve drink at a bar he had been visiting for decades. The Beck and Tenedorio families flipped the ceremonial coin at Super Bowl 59 on February 9th, a gesture that honored the lost but could not replace them. Investigations revealed that the city's existing anti-vehicle bollards had been removed for replacement ahead of the Super Bowl. The bollards that were supposed to stop a vehicle from entering the pedestrian zone were not physically present on the night of the attack. A 2019 security report had warned the French Quarter was vulnerable to exactly this type of attack. The report had been filed, read, and apparently forgotten. Multiple lawsuits were filed against the city, NOPD, and engineering contractors responsible for the Bollard Project. A memorial was installed on Bourbon Street in December 2025, and the one-year anniversary was marked with National Guard deployment and enhanced security measures. A warning that sat in a report since 2019. Bollards that were removed instead of replaced. And 14 people who never made it to the new year. 14 lives taken in a matter of minutes. But the next case also involves someone who was supposed to protect the public. A police officer who walked into a restaurant and opened fire on the people inside. The Kim An murders. On March 4, 1995, NOPD officer Antoinette Frank, 23, and her accomplice, 18-year-old Rogers Lacaze, entered the Kim An Vietnamese restaurant at 4952 Bullard Avenue in New Orleans East and took 3 lives. Fellow NOPD officer Ronald Ronnie Williams II, 25, who was working an off-duty security detail. Ha Vu, 24, the owner's eldest daughter who aspired to become a nun. And Quang Vu, who was an altar boy and aspiring priest. The motive was robbery. The family distrusted banks and kept cash on the premises. So how does a police officer end up robbing a restaurant she was supposed to be protecting, alongside a dealer she introduced as her nephew? Antoinette Frank had failed 2 psychological evaluations before being hired by the desperately understaffed NOPD. In February 1993, a psychiatrist rated her unsuitable for the job of police officer. The department was so short on bodies that they hired her anyway. She developed a relationship with Rogers Lacaze, a dealer she introduced as her nephew, while allowing him to ride in her patrol car and even drive it. She gave a known criminal access to a marked police vehicle. On the night of the incident, Frank and Lacaze visited the restaurant 3 times. Once to scout the layout and exits, once to eat, during which they stole a door key from employee Quoc Vu, and finally at 1:55 in the morning to carry out the crime. 3 visits in one night, each one more deliberate than the last. Lacaze shot Williams from behind, twice in the neck, severing his spinal cord. Frank then fired 9 bullets into Ha and Quang Vu as they knelt. She pistol-whipped Quang while demanding to know where the money was. Survivors Chow Vu and Quoc Vu hid in a walk-in cooler. They pressed themselves against the cold metal walls in the dark and did not make a sound. Chow had managed to hide the $10,000 cash in a microwave before the pair could find it initially, though Frank and Lacaze eventually located the money. After the incident, Frank dropped Lacaze off at his home, then returned to the crime scene in her police uniform as if she were responding to the call like any other officer. Investigators believe she came back specifically to eliminate the surviving witnesses. But when Chow saw other officers arrive, she ran to them, pointed directly at Frank and said, "You were there. You know everything. Why you ask me that question?" It was Chow Vu's courage in that moment that broke the case open. Without her identifying Frank at the scene, there is no telling how long the investigation would have taken. Frank confessed on tape. Lacaze used Williams's stolen Chevron credit card at a gas station 45 minutes after the incident, as if the gravity of what had just happened meant nothing to him. Both were convicted. Lacaze's jury returned a guilty verdict in July 1995. Frank's jury convicted in 22 minutes in September 1995, the fastest capital verdict in New Orleans history. 22 minutes. The jury barely needed to sit down before they had their answer. Both were sentenced to death. Lacaze was later resentenced to life without parole in December 2019 after a juror misconduct ruling. Frank remains the only woman on Louisiana's death row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women in St. Gabriel. As of 2025, she has ongoing appeals, with a hearing granted in April 2025. A chilling detail emerged months later. In November 1995, a human skull with a bullet hole was found buried under Frank's house. She had reported her father, Adam. Frank missing in 1993. Authorities believe she harmed him as well, meaning the Kim An incident may not have been her first. The case was chronicled in Chuck Hustmeyer's book, Killer with a Badge, a cop who failed 2 psych evaluations, hired anyway, because the department was desperate for bodies, and then used her badge to take 3 lives in a restaurant she was supposed to be protecting. The system did not fail to stop her. The system put her there. A cop who failed 2 psych evaluations, hired anyway, and then used her badge to commit the very crime she was supposed to prevent. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. But the next case connects back to the first one on this list in a way no one could have predicted, because the gunman's grandmother was Kim Groves herself. The Mardi Gras Day killings. On February 13, 2018, Mardi Gras Day, 2 gunmen opened fire with AK-47 style rifles outside a crowded party in the 5400 block of St. Claude Avenue in the lower 9th Ward. 2 men were taken and 3 others were wounded. More than 70 shell casings littered the street. It was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it became a crime scene. And the connection between this case and another on this list would not become clear until years later. So who were the shooters? And what does it mean when the cycle of harm in one family spans generations? The victims were Jamar Robinson, 26, and Byron Jackson, 21. Both were at a party on St. Claude Avenue. The intended target was heroin dealer Richard Bam Green, who was partying with the victims. A rival dealer had ordered the hit, believing Green had taken his son's life months earlier. Green escaped unharmed. Robinson and Jackson did not. The shooters were Derek Wu Groves, 22, and Kendall Barnes, 23. Lower 9th Ward dealers allegedly hired as hitmen. Both were convicted in October 2019 by a 10-2 split jury verdict, and mandatory life sentences were imposed. But Louisiana's subsequent requirement for unanimous jury verdicts, a landmark change in state law that applied retroactively, overturned the convictions and forced retrials. The first retrial in January 2023 ended in a mistrial when a juror was caught reading media accounts of the case during deliberations. The second in June 2023 produced a deadlocked jury that could not reach agreement. Finally, on October 18, 2024, Groves was found unanimously guilty on all counts. He also pleaded guilty to manslaughter in 2 separate incidents: the taking of Woodrow Smith in 2017 and Tyrone Francis in 2019, and to federal trafficking charges. 3 trials before a verdict that would hold. The legal system had to try 3 times to keep a convicted man behind bars. But the story did not end with the verdict. Before sentencing, Groves escaped from Orleans Parish Justice Center on May 16, 2025, one of 10 inmates who broke through a hole behind a toilet. He was the last to be recaptured, found hiding in a crawl space in Atlanta on October 8th after nearly 5 months on the run. On December 12, 2025, Judge Dennis Waldron sentenced him to 2 consecutive life sentences, plus 2 consecutive 50-year terms. Groves laughed and smiled throughout the sentencing hearing. Then came the detail that connected everything. Judge Waldron noted during sentencing that Groves's grandmother was Kim Marie Groves, the same woman taken in 1994 by a hitman ordered by corrupt NOPD officer Len Davis. The first case on this list. The judge told Groves he had failed to honor her memory. Kim Groves was taken by the system that was supposed to protect her. Her grandson grew up in the aftermath of that, in a city that recorded over 400 homicides the year she was lost, and became the very thing that had destroyed his family. That is not an excuse. But it is a pattern that New Orleans has never been able to break. A grandson who became what took his grandmother. But the next case goes back even further, to 1973, and a fire that the city tried to pretend never happened. Upstairs Lounge arson attack. On June 24, 1973, The final day of that year's Pride weekend and the 4th anniversary of the Stonewall riots, someone set fire to the stairway entrance of the upstairs lounge, a working-class gay bar at 604 Iberville Street in the French Quarter. Within 16 minutes, 32 people were dead or fatally injured. It was the deadliest attack on an LGBTQ venue in United States history until the 2016 Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. And the city of New Orleans responded by looking the other way. So who set the fire? And why did an entire city pretend it did not happen? The upstairs lounge, opened by Phyllis Steve on Halloween 1970, was accessible only via a single winding staircase. The windows were covered by iron bars, common protections for gay establishments of the era. The bar served as a community sanctuary, hosting drag shows, holiday events, and fundraisers. The Metropolitan Community Church, the nation's first gay Christian fellowship, had held services there in 1972. On that Sunday evening, approximately 60 to 90 patrons remained after a $1 beer bust, listening to pianist Bud Machi perform. Roger Dale Nunez, a 26-year-old with mental health problems, had been ejected from the bar earlier that evening for belligerent behavior. As bartender Buddy Rasmussen escorted him out, Nunez loudly threatened to burn the establishment. Minutes later, a customer matching his description purchased a 7-ounce can of Ronsonol lighter fluid from a nearby Walgreens. At approximately 7:53 in the evening, the arsonist emptied the can on the bottom of the front stairs and struck a match. When patron Luther Boggs opened the steel stairway door at 7:56 in response to a buzzer, the oxygen-starved fire exploded in a backdraft that instantly ignited the bar's carpeting, wallpaper, and ceiling tiles. The entire room was engulfed in seconds. The single stairway that served as the only main entrance was now a chimney of flame. Rasmussen, an Air Force veteran, vaulted the bar and led 20 to 40 patrons through an unmarked rear emergency exit to an adjacent rooftop. Most people in the bar did not know that exit existed. Those trapped tried to squeeze through windows covered with iron bars. Only the thinnest could fit through the 14-inch gaps. Some made it through. Others got stuck halfway. The fire was out by 8:12, 16 minutes from ignition to extinguished. 28 passed at the scene. 4 more succumbed to injuries in the following days and weeks. 32 people gone in the time it takes to order and eat a meal. Among the lost, Reverend Bill Larson, the MCC pastor, whose charred body became lodged in a window frame as he tried to push out an air conditioning unit. His body remained visible from the street for hours, photographed in what became the tragedy's defining image. His mother refused to claim his remains. Dwayne Mitch Mitchell, the MCC assistant pastor, escaped through the rear exit but ran back into the building to save his partner Louis Broussard. Their bodies were found together. Luther Boggs, who opened the fatal door, survived 16 days with third-degree burns to 50% of his body, and while hospitalized, was notified he had been fired from his teaching job. 2 victims remain unidentified to this day. The investigation was widely condemned. One officer told a reporter, "This was, after all, a queer bar." NOPD closed the investigation on August 30th, 1973, without ever formally questioning Nunez, despite his threats, a failed lie detector test, and multiple confessions to friends. Nunez took his own life on November 15th, 1974. The state fire marshal closed a separate investigation in 1980. No one was ever charged. The official cause remains undetermined origin. The city's response was equally shameful. No elected official publicly acknowledged the fire for days. Mayor Moon Landrieu, traveling in Europe, offered no statement. Most churches refused to hold memorial services. The Archbishop denied Catholic funerals to victims. Radio commentators joked about the remains. Only Father William Richardson of St. George's Episcopal Church held a small prayer service the next day and was rebuked by his bishop after receiving over 100 angry calls. The legacy has slowly grown. A bronze memorial plaque was installed at the site in 2003. In 2013, the Archbishop formally apologized. The New Orleans City Council formally apologized in 2022. The plaque was stolen in April 2024, but replaced in June 2025. 32 people, 16 minutes, and a city that took nearly 50 years to say it was sorry. 32 lives and decades of silence. But the next case happened in the years after Katrina, when the city was barely functioning, and a filmmaker who loved New Orleans more than anyone was taken just months after coming home. Helen Hill. At 5:30 in the morning on January 4th, 2007, a 36-year-old Harvard-educated animator and social activist was shot in her home at 2444 North Rampart Street in the Faubourg Marigny neighborhood of New Orleans. The case remains unsolved nearly 2 decades later. Her husband was shot 3 times and survived. Their 2-year-old son was in the next room. So who walked into Helen Hill's home that morning, and why has no one ever been charged? Helen Wingard Hill was born on May 9, 1970, in Columbia, South Carolina. She earned her bachelor's from Harvard in 1992 and her MFA from Cal Arts in 1995. Her animated films, crafted using hand-drawn celluloid, stop motion, and silhouette puppetry, earned a Rockefeller Foundation fellowship. Her 1995 thesis film, Scratch and Crow, was later inducted into the National Film Registry by the Library of Congress in 2009. She co-founded the New Orleans Film Collective and taught at the New Orleans Center for Creative Arts. She was not just an artist. She was someone who had built her life around giving back to the city she loved. Hill and her husband, Canadian physician Dr. Paul Galiunas, had returned to New Orleans in August 2006, exactly 1 year after evacuating from Katrina, which had flooded their mid-city home with 4 feet of water. Most people who left after Katrina did not come back. The population had dropped by more than half. The infrastructure was gutted. The streets were dark. Hill wanted to return anyway. She had waged a determined campaign to convince her reluctant husband to come back, secretly sending pre-addressed postcards to friends asking them to urge Galiunas to return. She believed in the city when the city could barely believe in itself. She wanted to be part of rebuilding it. They moved into the house on North Rampart Street, a neighborhood that was still finding its footing after the storm. On the morning of her passing, at approximately 5:10, a gunman had first approached a bed and breakfast 4 houses away, where a 60-year-old woman opened her door to find a man holding a weapon. Her husband pushed the door shut. Police responded within minutes. Investigators believe the intruder then hopped a back fence into Hill's yard just as she opened the kitchen door to let out their pot-bellied pig. Hill screamed, "Get away from my baby! Get out! Get out! Don't hurt my baby!" Galiunas, sleeping with their 2-year-old son Francis, ran toward her screams and found a man with a weapon standing over Helen. She had been shot once through the neck. The gunman followed Galiunas into the bathroom and shot him 3 times. He survived. Francis was physically unharmed. The investigation was widely criticized. Homicide detectives initially failed to connect Hill's case with the bed and breakfast burglary that had occurred minutes earlier on the same block, 4 houses away. 2 incidents on the same block, within minutes of each other, and the investigators treated them as separate cases. Evidence processing was delayed months. Police Superintendent Warren Riley publicly implied Galiunas might be a suspect, a suggestion that was contradicted by the physical evidence, by witness statements, and later ruled out entirely by DNA. The NOPD, working from FEMA trailers after losing its crime lab in the flooding, was operating with 500 fewer officers than pre-Katrina levels. The department was barely functional. Detectives were handling caseloads that would have been unmanageable even with a full staff. Hill's case was one of hundreds competing for attention in a city that was recording homicides at a pace that made national headlines. Hill's passing was the sixth in New Orleans in under 24 hours. 1 week earlier, Hot 8 brass band drummer Dinero Shavers, 25, had been shot in Tremé. The combined outrage sparked a march for survival on January 11th, when an estimated 3,000 to 5,000 people marched on City Hall, demanding action. The march created the organization Silence is Violence, which remains active today. HBO's Tremé later incorporated the storylines of both Hill's and Shavers' cases. Gayle Eunice eventually moved from New Orleans with Francis and settled in Southern California. He completed Hill's unfinished documentary, The Florestine Collection, in 2011. The $15,000 Crime Stoppers reward remains active. The NOPD Cold Case Unit has acknowledged the original investigation was short-sighted and now believes the intruder likely encountered Hill while fleeing the failed bed-and-breakfast burglary. No arrest has ever been made. A woman who fought to come back to a city she believed in, taken within months of her return. Nearly 2 decades, and still no answers. But the next case has answers. Disturbing ones, involving a couple who lured a young woman from Bourbon Street with a promise of $500 and then made sure she could never be identified. Jaron Lockhart. On the night of June 5th into the 6th, 2012, a 22-year-old exotic dancer and mother was lured from Temptation's Gentlemen's Club on Bourbon Street by a couple offering $500 for a private party. She told a co-worker she needed the money for rent. She had only made $75 that night. Her dismembered torso washed ashore on a beach in Mississippi the next day. So who were the people who took her from Bourbon Street? And how did they nearly get away with it? Jaron Lockhart had grown up in Tangipahoa Parish and was working on Bourbon Street to support herself and her 3-year-old daughter Riley while planning to pursue cosmetology school. She was 22 years old and trying to build a future. The headline writers would call her a Bourbon Street stripper. Her family called her a mother who was doing what she had to do to keep the lights on. On that night, Terry Speaks, 39, a doorman at a nearby club and registered offender from North Carolina living under a false identity, and his girlfriend Margaret Sanchez, 28, a fellow Bourbon Street dancer who knew Lockhart personally, approached multiple dancers before Lockhart agreed. She was not their first choice. She was the one who said yes because she needed $500 for rent. Surveillance footage captured the trio leaving Bourbon Street at 2:08 in the morning. A license plate camera in Kenner recorded Sanchez's green 2001 Chevrolet Lumina at 2:43. At the couple's home at 2029 Connecticut Avenue in Kenner, Lockhart was harmed with a single wound through the sternum that perforated her heart. Extensive bruising indicated she was restrained and struggled. The body was dismembered afterward, head removed, forearms removed, legs severed, and tattoos cut from the skin to prevent identification. They tried to erase who she was. License plate cameras later captured the car heading east into Mississippi that evening, then returning roughly 90 minutes later. The torso surfaced at Bay Street Louis on June 7th at 5:47 in the evening. Additional remains, a thigh, 2 calves, and the head, washed up along Pass Christian and Long Beach beaches over the following days. The removal of the tattoos had been deliberate, an attempt to make identification impossible. But Hancock County investigator Steve Saucier found another way. He matched the locations of the missing skin to Lockhart's tattoo sleeve photos posted on her social media accounts. The very thing the suspects tried to erase was the thing that identified her. DNA from her daughter confirmed the identification. When investigators aired surveillance footage on June 12th, Sanchez's own brother called to identify the couple. Her own family turned her in. They were pulled over in Tangipahoa Parish the next day, both with freshly dyed hair, his orange, hers blue. Speaks fled into the woods but was captured by U.S. Marshals. Their home reeked of bleach. A cadaver dog alerted near the back fence, and investigators found burned items in a backyard burn pile. Speaks was tried in June 2015. Fellow inmates testified he had described the act in detail while in custody. The jury convicted in 90 minutes of deliberation, and he was sentenced to life without parole, later enhanced to 2 consecutive life sentences as a habitual offender. Sanchez pleaded guilty on June 20, 2016, to reduced charges of manslaughter, obstruction, and conspiracy, receiving concurrent sentences totaling 40 years. Both remain incarcerated in the Louisiana correctional system. Lockhart's forearms and hands were never recovered. A young mother who needed $500 for rent. That is all it took to lure her to the people who would take everything from her. $500 and a promise. But the final case on this list takes us to the French Quarter, Gothic underworld, a hotel hot tub, and a group of strangers who turned a night out into something far darker. Shawn Johnson. On July 20, 2003, a 34-year-old lighting designer from Atlanta was found in a blood-filled hot tub at the Marriott Courtyard Hotel in the French Quarter. He had been bludgeoned with champagne bottles and drowned after a night at the Dungeon, one of New Orleans' most notorious Gothic bars. So who did he leave with that night? And what happened in that hotel room? Shawn Christopher Johnson had been in New Orleans working as a subcontractor for a Microsoft convention, checking in on July 13th with plans to leave July 19th. On his last night, he visited the Dungeon at 738 Toulouse Street, a midnight to 6 establishment with black walls, skulls, red lighting, and a strict no photography policy that had been a fixture of the French Quarter's Gothic scene since 1969. There, he befriended several members of the local goth community. The group left the Dungeon in the early morning hours and stopped near Jackson Square, where witness Jerry Lambert overheard 2 of them say they were going to roll Johnson, meaning rob him. Around 5 to 6 in the morning, hotel surveillance captured 5 people heading to Johnson's room. Johnson, Chris Mitchell Lane, 24, known as Worry; Carla Nicole Fry, approximately 19 to 20, known as Never; Benjamin Anthony, approximately 24, and a 4th person known as Deirdre or Cat. Johnson had purchased the champagne. 3 of them got into the hot tub. Anthony pulled the Gideon Bible from the nightstand and began ripping out pages, sticking them to the walls and ceiling. Deirdre left early. As she departed, Fry told her she would not know how much fun she would miss. At approximately 6:45 in the morning, Lane struck Johnson over the head from behind with an empty champagne bottle, shattering it, then struck him with a second. With Johnson unconscious, Lane held his head underwater until he drowned. Anthony was horrified and threatened to call police. Fry, laughing, told him, "It's okay, we've done this before." They fled the room, Fry leaving behind her distinctive rag doll, a familiar with moss in its hair and a dog collar, on the bed. A hotel maid discovered Johnson's body at approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, partially submerged in bloody water, surrounded by Bible pages stuck to the walls and ceiling. The scene looked like something out of a horror film, but it was real. NOPD. Detective Winston Harbin led the investigation, working through the goth community's street name-only culture. Nobody used real names. Everyone went by aliases. Tracking down individuals known only as Worry, Never, and Cat required detectives to immerse themselves in a subculture most of them had never encountered. A goth named Spin from Reverend Zombie's voodoo shop identified Never as Carla Fry, a brunette wearing a blonde wig, and explained the rag doll was her familiar, a term from the occult community for a spiritual companion object. An anonymous tipster identified Worry as Chris Mitchell Lane. Fry turned herself in on July 26th in Florida. Lane was arrested in Bradenton, Florida on August 3rd after bragging about what he had done. Anthony was arrested August 1st. Fry's trial on August 25th, 2005, was reportedly the last criminal jury trial before Hurricane Katrina. She was convicted of negligent homicide and sentenced to up to 5 years. Lane pleaded guilty to manslaughter and simple robbery on May 12, 2006, receiving 45 years. Anthony pleaded guilty as an accessory and received 4 years. Lane was found hanging in his cell at Angola on March 1, 2013, an apparent suicide at age 33. Fry served her sentence and was released, but continued criminal activity. She was arrested in Mobile, Alabama on March 9, 2023, for stealing a fire hydrant, with other contraband also found in her possession. The case has been heavily mythologized by ghost tours and paranormal media as a vampire case, with fabricated claims of throat slitting and blood drinking that never happened. None of that is true. The actual crime was a robbery that turned fatal, carried out by people Johnson had trusted enough to invite to his hotel room after a night of drinking and conversation. He thought he had made friends. They thought they had found a target. A man who came to New Orleans for a work convention went out for a drink on his last night in town and never made it home. The French Quarter gave him one final night, and it took everything. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.